This screencast supports this lesson on forming adjectives, and it's taken from Cutting Edge Upper Intermediate Students' Book, 3rd edition by S. Cunningham, P. Moore and J. Bygrave, and it's published by Pearson. So the topic of the lesson is describing how you feel, and it starts off with some vocabulary and speaking and a little reading text. So let's have a look at that. So task 1 is read the facts at the top of the page, so here, then work in groups and discuss. Do they surprise you? Can you think of any explanations for them? So there's some different facts here. For example, more women than men feel bad-tempered in the morning. Most parents say that spending time with their children is what makes them happiest, etc. So they just read those. They can do that as a whole group, or you can get them into small groups to just briefly discuss anything that surprised them and any explanations they might have for that, any reasons they can give. You might find that you need to check the meaning of grumpy with the students. So this text introduces some of the adjectives that are relevant to the lesson. The next brief reading task asks the students to read about a new phone app, and that's this second paragraph here, and answer the questions. There are 3 questions. Just make sure they can read the questions before they look at the text, and get them to read, answer, and then peer check before you get some feedback. So again, this text is focusing on the topic of feelings. The next exercise is a pair work activity or small groups, and it asks the students to look at these adjectives in the yellow box that are used in the app that they've just read about and make sure they understand them. So you need to decide, you need to anticipate beforehand which ones you're going to concept check with them. So have a look through them. Which ones do you anticipate they won't know? And try and prepare some concept checking questions to make sure that they're clear about the meaning before they go ahead with this exercise. So I might choose awkward when describing feelings. I would make sure they understand grumpy if you haven't already checked it for the first reading they did. Insecure might be a good one to check. And unsociable and upset, I would guess, would be the ones to prepare CCQs for. And then think about which ones you need to drill. Which ones are difficult to say? Well, certainly awkward, awk, that sound is quite hard, isn't it? And words like enthusiastic. There's a th sound and the y, the intrusive y, and thinking about where the word stress is. So there's lots going on in that adjective there. So think about which ones you're going to need to drill. Okay, they won't necessarily be the same ones that you're checking the meaning of. So once you've covered the rules of these adjectives, the students can talk together and say which of the adjectives they rarely or never feel. So they can talk for a bit about themselves here. So get some feedback and then they can move on to the next exercise. So here in exercise 3A, there are several situations listed, and the students need to tick the situations on the list that are relevant to their life, and then add 3 more situations that they often find themselves in. So having a look through the list here, is there any vocabulary that needs to be pre-taught? I would say a family gathering, and possibly commuting. The verb to commute would be useful before they start doing this activity. So let them tick the situations. let them add 3 more that they often find themselves in, and then they can speak together about their answers. And then to extend on that, they choose 2 adjectives from the app, so the adjectives they've done previously in the yellow box they've looked at, and they need to choose 2 of those adjectives to describe their feelings in the situations here. And they need to be honest and rate the strength of their feelings from 1 to 5. That's optional, you can do that or not. So for example, if I'm late for an appointment, okay, so that's one of the things on the list, I feel stressed and panicky, extremely panicky. I can't stand being late. Okay, so get them to really, expand on how they feel and use 2 adjectives. So they're practicing those adjectives in the yellow box when they're speaking about these situations. Let them do that in small groups and then get some feedback. And they can compare their feelings with the others in the group. So, some people may not care if they're late, whereas others might feel really stressed and panicky, for example. So they've had a lot of opportunity so far for discussion and for thinking about their own feelings, and they've started using some of the adjectives. So now we're going to move on to the analysis of these adjectives and how to form them, okay? So the book presents it like this. Number 1, look at the adjectives in the text and from the phone app on page 16 and underline 5 prefixes and 5 suffixes. So the students go back and look at the adjectives in the yellow box and the text they read at the beginning of the lesson, and they find some prefixes and suffixes, 5 of each, okay? And then they can start to look at the rules. Okay, so they put the adjectives in the correct column here. So give them this as a task. So we've got un, in, im and dis. So they can, from the adjectives that they've found from the yellow box and the text, they can put those into the correct column. So for example, insecure, impatient and dissatisfied and so on. Okay, so these are all prefixes that mean the opposite of. And then prefixes that modify the meaning of the adjective. For example, self-aware, better informed, etc. And then suffixes that form adjectives. These are instead of going at the start like prefixes, they go at the end of the adjective. And then again, they find the adjectives with these suffixes. Okay. The next part, 2a, is looking at the difference between adjectives ending with ed and ing. So it's just 2 tasks here. Choose the best adjective in the sentences below. The meeting was very frustrated or frustrating. They have to choose the correct one. I felt very frustrated or frustrating during the meeting. So they decide, they talk together, and then they think of at least 5 more adjectives like this. 5 more adjectives where you could put ed or ing at the end. So for example, interested, interesting, bored, boring. Okay, so I would set them all of this, 1 and 2, to go off and do in small groups. Okay, make sure that they're really clear on what they need to do for both of them, and then set a time limit, let them go off and complete this task in their groups, then bring them back and check the answers. Okay, so making sure they've got all the answers in the correct columns, they've come up with the correct answers here, and that they understand why we use ed sometimes and why we use ing sometimes. So adjectives ending with ed describes the feeling, and adjectives ending with ing describes the thing or the person or whatever it is that's causing that feeling. Once you're happy with the meaning side of things, you can move on to form. Just make sure that they know that an adjective goes before a noun in English, and drill any that you feel are useful at this stage. Now it's time for some practice, so they can do this gap fill here and complete the adjectives in the sentences. Okay, so do the first one together and elicit whether it's an ing or an ed ending, or if you need what type of prefix or suffix you need. It's a suffix here because it comes after the first part. Okay, and then let them either do these alone and peer check before feedback, or get them working together to fill in the gaps. Get some feedback, making sure that you're checking that they understand why. For example, it's ed and not ing, or the other way round, and that they're checking back to the work they did in groups previously on the rules if they're still unsure about which form the adjective should take. And then make sure they can see all the answers, and then they can briefly, just as a group rather than in pairs, say which of these words of wisdom they like best. And any new adjectives that have come up in this exercise, they can then add them to their list that they did previously in the grammar box. Exercise 3A introduces some new prefixes, these ones here, and ask the students to put the correct prefix in the gap using the definition to help them. So set that up with an example, elicit the first one, and allow them to do the activity, making sure they peer check if they've done it alone, and get the answers and make sure they can see those answers. Prepare some concept checking questions for any that you think are quite challenging meaning wise, and prepare to also to drill any of the ones that are difficult to say. Now for some freer speaking practice. So this activity is a nice one for them to use as many of those adjectives as they can. So it says things that make you feel good. A group of people were asked which things in your life make you feel good and which make you feel bad. Look at the most frequent answers below. Is anything important missing? So have a look at all these different ideas here and see if the students can add at least one thing each to that list for things in life that make people feel good and things that make people feel bad. Okay, and then 2A, they can work in groups and make lists with the ideas in exercise 1. So which of these things make people feel good, which make them feel bad, and which could be both. They could do that as a group, or they could make their own lists individually and then put them into smaller groups and get them to talk. So they can talk about all of these things using as many of the adjectives as possible. So before you send them off into their groups, make sure you do a clear demo with a student to show them the kind of thing you want them to do. So for example, lack of sleep and exhaustion. I might elicit from my students, how does that make you feel good, or does it make people feel bad? Usually bad. Why? How does it make them feel? And then try and elicit some of the adjectives that we've been using. It makes them feel stressed, sleepy, easily upset, etc., etc. Could make people feel depressed. Okay, so elicit a couple of examples and then send them off to discuss all of these and the ones they've added using as many of the adjectives as possible. Monitor for examples of good use of the adjectives and some incorrect use. Get them back, get some feedback on their ideas, what did they find out, and then do some post-fluency error correction at the end.